perspectives, and what shall I say? The latest step in an evolving friendship from very different orientations. So it's quite lovely. So hang on a second. I can't do this, and I will.
We're waiting for the skirting.
It's not the skirt. What did I do with the zapper? Okay. There it is. Thank you. All righty, my friend.
He asked me to do it in uniform, but for those that have known me for the last few years, any uniform I would have had would not fit anymore.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm not in uniform. I'm starting, right?
Yep.
Sailor and the Draft Dodger. Fun start. I was born into the military. My father is a retired Army. One of those pictures that went flying by there, if anybody knows what a drill instructor was, the one with the hat that looks like Smokey the Bear, that was my dad going through. So I've known Army life or military life my whole life. Came into the military, traveling around, had the pleasure of being able to play on things, like tanks. Got to watch guns come around and stuff like that, and all that thing. And as a little kid, it's kind of an enjoyment thing that you have out of it. You get that aspect of it. The 4th of July came around. There was always big fireworks. There was always parties and parades. Veterans Day rolled around. There was always a celebration out of it and the remembrance of it. Memorial Day, you always had the remembrance out of it. But you always were dealing with that aspect of things. And, I went through different aspects of things as I was growing up, too. One of the things that I saw was the departure that you have. We had just come back from Germany. I was about 5.5 when my dad left for the first time for Vietnam. And you came into the realization of the fact that, one, we don't have instant messaging, we don't have email. It was months before you knew whether or not your father or your brother or whatever was still alive. And then, that was only 2 weeks ago. You didn't know instantaneously. So that came to as a realization, as a 5 or 6 year old. It doesn't really kind of hit you or anything like that. About 3 years later, my dad went back a second time. And then you come to that realization. Now I'm not in my teens yet. I'm just before my teens and everything like that. But you still get that realization of the fact that you have to have military service. You have to work your way through that aspect of things. And still didn't mind the military. I was still raised the same thing. I got to live at next to Air Force bases. It was always great to watch the fighters come over. It was always great to watch the big cargo planes come in and land. I used to go sit down at the end of the runway and just watch them fly over. It was an enjoyable thing to see. But again, still from a kid's aspect, I was watching that. Then I got into high school. My dad retired just before I graduated from high school and did that nice thing of moving me between my junior and senior year because he retired. But that didn't put me off or anything like that. In the long run, I had accepted an application to West Point. I was going there, but then I also accepted an ROTC scholarship in the Navy. And desire was to go to Penn State. So I went to Penn State, and I'm not going to talk about anything on that. I will say one thing. There was one great thing that came out of Penn State, and she's sitting right there. If I had gone to West Point, that probably wouldn't have happened. But after that, went through Penn State, got a degree in nuclear engineering. So what better thing to do than to go under a nuclear submarine, right? I get seasick. They go under the water, it's calm. No, it's not. Not as bad as a surface ship, but it's not as calm. So I did that, and now I'll let you go from where I am right there.
All righty. Well, I didn't grow up in a military family, though my dad was in the Navy. He'd gone to USC, so he went into the Navy as a second lieutenant. And as Michael and I were talking about this, my orientation to the Navy was like McHale's Navy. My dad ended up being the supply officer on New Guinea. Well, now on New Guinea, they had the experience of a bomb landing there once. It was a dud, so it wasn't a big deal. And that was the full scope of the heroism of my father on New Guinea. Though, he did have, what do I want to say, heroic poker games. And he spent most of his time playing poker, winning, and I suspect stealing from the commissary, since that's what supply officers do, and sending money home to my mother. Okay? It was a very different orientation. When I was 18, I got a notice from the draft board that says you have to come in for a physical. My orientation to the world then was clueless. That's an abiding theme in my life. And I got into, they said, okay, come to Los Angeles. I was living in Newport Beach. They said, come to Los Angeles for your induction physical. I got on the bus. I saw a bunch of long-haired hippies in the back, and I said, my kind. And I went back there, I sat down, and they immediately started passing around these funny-looking cigarettes. An hour later, I got to the induction center. I remember very clearly walking up the stairs. They opened the door. I looked around and I went, ah! My blood pressure went through the ceiling. It wouldn't come down. Hours later, they had me lying down. And they said, well, we can't take you now, son. You have high blood pressure. Go get it checked and come back and see us in 6 months. About 2 years later, when they caught up with me again, I'll tell that story later. Michael.
My first tour was on board the USS Michigan in the engineering department, which is what I'd been trained to do. In the long run, you become what they refer to as a nuclear plumber. You have to move water and produce steam to move the ship through the ocean. But the ship itself is out there doing a deterrence factor, right? It's out there as a threat to protect us against everything that's going with it. And I found out that being in the military is a job, all right? You're doing something, you get up in the morning, you go to work, you get up, you go to sleep and everything like that. The difference is on board a ship, it's 24 hours a day. The other thing is I find out that you really are at a threat your whole time. And the reason being is sometimes when you're sleeping, there's an 18-year-old driving your ship. And some of those 18-year-olds are probably like Tom was when he was thinking about going into school. They haven't been drafted, but sometimes they just kind of wander where they're going and different things, which is why you usually have somebody watching them most of the time. But I will relate one quick story of how quickly it comes to you on the fact of what can happen to you. We sat down for dinner on Halloween. It's about 5:20 in the evening. Any kind of pressure change on board a submarine, you can sense that real quickly in your ears because it's an enclosed environment. So we're all sitting there, and all of us at dinner all reach up to our ears to clear them because there's been a pressure change in the boat. 5 seconds later, you get over the 1MC, fire in the engine room. Okay? Now, I just told you it's an enclosed environment. Okay? Not a good thing. I talked to the engineering officer of the watch afterwards. He said it was less than 3 seconds before the smoke was so bad, you could not see an inch in front of your face. Okay? Now, the good news was it actually wasn't a true fire in the fact that we actually had flames and everything going like that. We had a small explosion in the propulsion lube oil system, which produced a bunch of smoke. But it also put us at the top of the ocean, bobbing around with no propulsion for about 10 hours as we tried to get our atmospheres back. That means we're wearing what they refer to as an emergency breathing apparatus, or an EAB, which means you got something stuck in your face, and you're plugged into forced air. So if you have to move, you have to unplug yourself, and you have to find the next connection. Okay? Now, up forward where there's no smoke, that's okay. You can see where you're going. Back in the engine room, if you're trying to move around and fight, you either find your next buddy, because there are buddy clips, which are nice things to know, and you can tether yourself a pretty good distance, and hopefully someone in the beginning of that line doesn't disconnect on you without a warning, because all of a sudden that mask goes when you suck in and there's no air there. But you come to the realization that your life is always at a threat. All right? And that happens whether you're at sea or whether you're at shore, whether you're training or whatever. Examples being, training accidents that occur with aircraft. We lose people that way. So that realization that, hey, this is a job kind of becomes this is a life, and you're kind of living it in that aspect of things. And you start looking at the fact that everybody that's around you is not necessarily out there wanting to end up where we were in World War I, which the war to end all wars, in World War II, in the Korean conflict, in Vietnam, We don't get there, so, or we haven't gotten there, so we have to start looking further.
Okay. Well, when the Army found me, 2 years later, I was living in Boulder, Colorado. By then, I had friends. I had seen friends who had come back from Vietnam. I had friends who had died in Vietnam. The friends that came back were messed up in ways that flabbergasted me. It was overwhelming to me. I looked around at guys like Michael's dad, those drill sergeants. I probably didn't know the reality of it, but I said, do you remember that song in the 60s? He can't even run his own life. I'll be damned if he'll run mine. That was my song, okay? That was my song. And I looked around and I said, you know, if the Canadians are attacking us, I'm going to be out there with my machete. But I just don't get this little country more than 10,000 miles away on the other side of the earth and how that poses any threat to me or to my friends. I don't get it. I was ready to go to Canada. They called me in for another physical, and I was ready to head for Canada because there was just no way I was going to be part of this. And the night before I went into Denver for the physical, a man said to me, a friend of mine, he says, you know, there's something you need to know. They only know what they see of you when you walk in the door. And he spent the next 3 hours explaining to me how I could convince them that I was crazy. You guys know me well enough that that didn't seem like a big stretch, but this was a very intended, and there was a lot around it. I went in. There were letters there from anti-war psychiatrists telling them that I was crazy, I was gay. I mean, the whole list. Anything that they knew about that would be a red flag at that moment was it. And I went in there, and I shook, I stared at the floor, and I mumbled. And they said, son, you're going to get a 4F, which is going to be just horrible for your future. I go, ugh. And they sent me away. I think God was on my side because somebody blew up my draft board about a week later and I disappeared. But I was convinced, if it hadn't been for that, I was heading for Canada.
My second tour at sea, I wanted to get back out here. You know, when we first came out here from Barbara and I, you know, you've seen the Grand Canyon. That's Barbara's claws going across the country as I pulled her from the East Coast to the West. The other half of it was dug even deeper when I pulled her from the West Coast back to the East, let's put it that way. So we wanted to come back out here. So I did anything I could to come back here and everything like that. And as having been in the engineering department, the only way to get back here was now to be in the weapons department. Okay? Now, that means I was a weapons officer on board the Ohio, which means literally I have the trigger to everything that's on board. Granted, I couldn't do anything by myself. I needed others with me and would never have done that. But, you know, you get into this situation of the fact I'm still doing a job, right? If I'm asked to do my job, I'm going to do my job, and it's going to be a big result with it. But as I came to an interesting realization. First off, those of us on board the submarine are not out there going, we want to do our job. Okay? Because one realization came to me is if I have to do my job, there's no reason to come home because it's here. And guess what? Here is within distance of there, meaning Bangor, and it's not going to be here if I've had to do my job. The real realization came through lighting the peace candle for Blake. Thank you very much for doing that. I know of one other person that's lit that in uniform. And that was me, and that was during that time frame when I was on board the Ohio. Dick Kroll was here at that point in time, and he had made some statement during one service or whatever, and I never came in uniform. I never really brought out the fact that I was in the military. You know, people knew it and everything like that. But he made some comment about having to be our whole selves when we come here. And I had a I'll call it an epiphany or revelation that I'll talk about in just a second on board the ship the last time I was at sea. And I said to him, I said, Dick, I have to talk. Took about a month before we get to that point. I said, I wanted to light the peace candle. I said, it took about a month before we get to that point. And of course, by then, I'm like going, I don't need to do it anymore. But just before I got to do it, I said to him, the other aspect of it is because it's me, I need to do it in uniform. Is that going to be a problem? And he said, no. He says, that's probably what should happen. So when I came to talk about that, the revelation I had was a submarine that's in port is not ready to do its job by way of launching missiles or anything like that. There's preventions, there's precautions and everything like that. When you go to sea, we go into what they refer to as an alert status. And at that point in time, we're ready to go. You know, and when I say ready to go, I'm talking 30 minutes later, we could be done our job if given the order. We were getting ready to go alert, and we were supposed to go alert at 5 o'clock our time on a Monday morning, or Monday evening, excuse me. So I had decent time to do the work that I needed to do. But my captain came to me on Sunday morning and said, I want you to get ready now. Yeah, somebody over here just whispered it. Easter Sunday. Okay? Now, I was raised Catholic. I was a non-practicing Catholic. But I had started attending, Barbara and I started attending church here when I came back out here as a weapons officer. Things that started to go through my mind, I'm going like this. This was not the thing to do on Easter. Okay? And there's a little area off in the ward, it's called the wardroom study, that I was sitting in waiting to figure out how to go talk to my guys about doing this on Easter Sunday. And I was listening to a George Strait song, it's Love Without End. And basically it talks about the things we do in our life and whether or not people will still love us in the long run. And the last verse talks about whether or not God will still love us. So we did our work. We got this stuff done with it and everything like that. But I realized the fact that we're there, but it's not the fact that we're out there wanting to start a war. We're not out there trying to kill other people and hunt our ways through things like that. Barbara's oldest sister made an interesting comment when we first came out here. She used to work with torpedoes over at Keyport when I was in Bangor. And her sister's comment to us one time was, you are the two most pacifistic people I've ever seen to be working with the military.
After the Vietnam War, I started watching people come back, guys come back, primarily guys, come back from this war. Had friends that came back, and they were treated horribly. They were spit upon. They were cursed. And I started to look at this and I said, wait a minute, something is really, really wrong here. These guys didn't start this war. They're out there doing a job. And at a young age, I said, wait, we have to separate these two. We have to separate our political corporate wars from the individuals who believe in that, hold it in their heart that they are doing the right thing and are willing to give their lives for it. I may disagree with their beliefs that send them to war, but I am a champion of the heart and commitment they have behind those beliefs. And we had done something vastly wrong to them. Later in the 90s in the Gulf War, I was stunned. I looked at this and I said, this war was well done. As a very far leftist pacifist, to look at a war and say, I have just watched General Schwarzkopf and Colin Powell lead a war where we said, a friend of ours is in danger, we will step in, we will help, and we will stop. I couldn't believe that our military was capable of that. I said, I have seen wisdom I never ever expected to see from this institution I have at a gut level demonized most of my life. Then I got to walk with a friend and a neighbor. He and I would walk 2, 3, 4 times a week. He was a colonel in the Army. And he started to talk to me. And he said, you have a really different picture of what's going on. You missed it. The people that get to be general, the people that move up through these layers are very different individuals. And I felt like I got to know personally who was making decisions, why this was happening. And it shifted my whole perspective on it. Now at this point, I'm happy. I am delighted that I know people who are leading, who are living in a military situation with heart and wisdom to do a really, really hard job and do it with integrity.
My last tour was teaching. I got to teach prospective weapons officers. I got to teach prospective executive officers and commanding officers the job that they were supposed to be doing. And you come to the realization as you work with all these different people, as Tom's saying, is that they are people. All right? They are people that are working through things. They're not sitting out there trying to figure out how to start a war or anything like that. I remember listening to my dad, who talks now more than he ever did about Vietnam when he was actually occurring with it. But one of the things that, as a drill instructor, he said there was two things that he was supposed to do. One, he was supposed to teach people how to do their job, which means he needed to teach them to shoot. He needed to teach them how to use different things like that. But the other thing they needed to do was he needed to teach them to live, how to come home safely. All right? His biggest fear was that every 18-year-old that he worked with would not come home during different time frames. My son makes an interesting statement. He says, my dad used all of the Balkus luck in Vietnam. And with some of the stories that my dad has come back with, I can understand that. His last tour there, he was teaching EOD and booby traps, and commented on the fact one time he had one in his hand that he thought was dead, thought it was a dud. Pulled the pin on it, was working with it and everything like that, threw it over to the side and found out it wasn't. Every time, and this is a bad part of what's going on, every time he left a division or an area or whatever, they were either attacked or they went into some place where a lot of them were lost. The last picture that went across just before the cross is going to the Vietnam Memorial. My dad, when I was stationed in D.C. before 2003, my dad came up there and we went down to see the Vietnam Memorial. And it was very, very moving for me to see what was going on with my father, because I hadn't seen this before. But there's a whole wall there, and you can never find anybody. The way you do it is you go over and there's a little book off to the side, and you can go through alphabetically, and you can find a name, and then the name tells you what panel they're on and what row they're in, and then you can go do a sketch through it and everything like that. And I never thought of my father to be extremely emotional, but my dad was over on that book looking for names. He was looking for a lieutenant that he had worked with and trying to find out whether or not he had survived or not. He never found the name in there, so he assumed that he did. But in the last couple of years, my dad has done something that I had never expected, and that is he's gone to Vietnam reunions. Reunions from people that he had served with before, and he's starting to see these things. And he's reconnected with a radio man that he had in Vietnam that they both survived through an aspect of it and are very good friends, and they talk basically on a weekly thing. The military is a necessity, okay? The military, though, is not an organization that is out there trying to take over the world in the aspect of it, at least our military, I'll say. And the people that are in it are people. I find it very interesting, as Tom was talking about, when my father came back, there was no recognition. 23 years in the military service, yes, he got his retirement and everything like that, but by way of the community, there wasn't any real recognition. We started to see a little bit more of that with Desert Storm, which was when I was getting back into coming back to the sub the second time. But really, when I retired, it was like, you're still just in the military, you're retired, and there really still wasn't any recognition per se. With what we've done the last couple of years, you're starting to see a lot more recognition of people, acknowledging the fact that the service that's going on, acknowledging those people that have served for us before, and we have to continue to remember it because we really don't want to go back to the other aspect of it, because World War I, World War II were fought seeing eye to eye. The 1915 and actually killing somebody hand to hand is what was happening then. You knew or you saw what was going on behind you. In today's world, you never have to see a thing. And that's a concern, because we never know, we never see the damage with it. The things that we lost out of this last aspect of things, where the government had made the decision to not show coffins coming back, we don't see our losses, we don't acknowledge our losses, other than they're just some number. And we have to remember that those numbers belong to other people.
Invite you for 2 minutes of silence.
Wait.